Carol was 65 when that morning began, with the smell of salt and slightly burnt coffee in the old coffee pot. That same metallic hiss she recognized even with her eyes closed from her early morning shifts at the hospital. A widow, a retired nurse, she had learned to measure the world in pulses. The blow of the wind against the terrace awning on Cape Cod, the cadence of a refrigerator whining in a high-pitched tone, the alcohol-stained clock she never got used to letting go of. The beach house wasn't just an inherited property, it was a living reliquary. The summers with her daughter Madison, the pancakes at 6 in the morning, the ritual of sweeping sand from the hallway like someone collecting memories. That late September morning, with a sky as white as watered-down milk, Carol oiled the wooden railing and checked that the oars were still in their place, because the habits of a nurse had become the habits of a guardian of her own world. He spoke to the sea in a low voice, like someone consulting a lifelong friend. "Stay with me for another winter." The smell of varnish and saltpeter mingled in the air, and for a moment he believed peace had permeated every floorboard. What he didn't know, and what history must now admit, is that the wound of that day already had a date and a sender, wrapped in sweet words but bearing the unmistakable weight of contempt. Everything came to a head when, sitting at the kitchen table with the crocheted tablecloth she'd inherited from her mother under her phone, Carol opened the Blue app and watched her daughter's life flash by in small, glowing windows. The engagement announced on Facebook, the wedding reception she'd learned about through stories, and that trendy expression, healthy boundaries, used as a glass wall between mother and daughter. Her hand trembled, not from age, but from that icy shock that rises in the chest when betrayal becomes official. Instinctively, she resorted to the exercise she'd taught so many times. To anxious patience, inhale in 4 counts, exhale in 4 counts, even if the air tasted of rust. The message was direct, without ceremony. Madison announced that she had gotten married in a civil ceremony to simplify things, and asked for the keys to the beach house so they could spend their honeymoon there. Because it's the perfect place to start over. Carol squeezed the compass-shaped keychain her late husband had bought at the pier shop and stared at that needle that never pointed true. North, turning wherever you pushed it. The refrigerator groaned again in its high-pitched note, and she realized the morning soundtrack had changed tone. This wasn't just a request, but a script where she was merely a luxury extra, useful for the setting, dispensable for the plot. And there, with the cup leaving a coffee ring on the crocheted tablecloth, began the day Carol decided no one would use the word restart to take her home away from her, much less her daughter. For weeks, Carol tried to convince herself that it was all a passing misunderstanding, a mirage born of Madison's youth and Trevor's superficial charisma. She had only met him at a Sunday lunch, when he still seemed like a charming man who knew how to choose his words like someone picking perfect shells on the seashore. He had a wide but empty smile, one of those that never quite touched the eyes, and a way of squeezing her hand too tightly, as if he needed to demonstrate dominance in every everyday gesture. Carol had noticed her daughter's discomfort when he put his arm around her back, possessive even in the slightest. But she kept quiet so as not to seem like the controlling mother she had always promised not to be. Little by little, that lunch became the first brick in an invisible wall Trevor was building between them. The wall grew quickly. Madison stopped answering calls, postponed visits to the beach house, and began repeating phrases that didn't seem like her own. "Mom, we have to set boundaries." "Mom, I need to prioritize my relationship." "Mom, it's not healthy to depend so much on each other." Carol recognized Trevor's voice hidden beneath her daughter's mouth in those words. She had spent her life listening to nuances, first in the breathing of patients in intensive care, and now in Madison's intonation, and she knew how to differentiate the spontaneous from the imposed. The wound wasn't just the distance, but the theatricality with which her daughter seemed to play a role written by someone else. Every time she closed her laptop and saw the glossy photos of events she hadn't been invited to, she felt fragments of her life being ripped away, as if she were witnessing her own slow-motion erasure. Suspicions began to grow when Carol noticed a disturbing pattern on social media. Trevor always appeared at the center of the photographs, with Madison orbiting him like an obligatory satellite. In each image, he displayed different watches, luxury brands too, expensive for someone who claimed to work independently and without stability. Carol, who had learned to read between the lines in medical reports, also began to read between the poses and digital smiles. She remembered seeing those same watches in ads for discreet auctions, and her intuition told her there was more to the story behind the shiny facade. One morning, unable to sleep, she opened old folders of clippings and found a yellowed note about a financial fraud that had occurred decades earlier with a surname identical to Trevor's, a scandal involving her grandfather accused of embezzling millions. The discovery wasn't an isolated coincidence, but the piece that began to fit together with everything else. Carol remembered that her late husband, Madison's father, had lost a considerable sum of money around that time and had always suspected a business partner with a similar last name. Connecting the dots, a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't a mere coincidence, Trevor belonged to that same family. The blood pounded in her temples as if she were in the middle of an emergency room. But this time the patient was her daughter. Her pulse racing, she realized that Trevor wasn't just trying to isolate Madison emotionally, but had chosen her family as a strategic target. What had seemed like a love match was beginning to reveal itself as a premeditated gambit, a repeat of patterns that had destroyed lives before. Aware that she was facing something much bigger than a simple family conflict, Carol began investigating with the meticulousness she had honed over decades of hospital shifts. She delved into public records, reviewed articles in digital newspaper archives, and contacted former colleagues of her husband who still harbored memories of the fraud that had scarred him. Each discovery was another brick in the wall of certainty. Trevor not only came from a family tainted by financial crimes, but he himself had replicated the pattern with other women. Names appeared: Emma and Sarah, heirs to different estates, both linked to brief and abrupt relationships with Trevor, both with veiled allegations of manipulation and unexplained financial losses. Carol's grief mingled with a kind of serene fury, the same one that had sustained her through endless nights of emergencies. Madison saw nothing, or preferred not to, caught in the web of calculated attention Trevor deployed with surgical precision. Carol remembered the tired eyes of patients who refused to accept the diagnosis and understood that her daughter was in that same denial. But this time, she couldn't simply offer comfort. She had to act as the guardian she had always been. As she watched the waves crash against the stones of the shore, she made the most difficult decision. If Trevor had transformed his relationship with Madison into a strategy of plunder, she would transform her love for her daughter into a plan of counterattack. The idea for the counterattack took shape one drab afternoon as Carol arranged the folders on her late husband's desk. Among the forgotten papers, she found a fountain pen he used to sign contracts, and that simple image inspired her. She too would sign a document, not with ink, but with proof. She spent weeks compiling every possible scrap of information, assembling a kind of dossier with press clippings, suspicious financial statements, and forum testimonials that spoke about Trevor with the same mix of fear and anger she felt. The result was a thick, carefully organized folder, which she decided to mentally christen a wedding gift. The day of the delivery arrived faster than she imagined. Madison had agreed to meet with her under the pretext of putting her hard feelings aside, and Trevor, with that false courtesy he used as a disguise, accompanied her. Carol welcomed them to the beach house, the refuge that had so often been a family sanctuary. On the wooden table, instead of flowers or glasses, lay the folder. In a calm, almost maternal voice, she said, "This is my gift to you." Trevor smiled smugly until he began to leaf through the contents. Within seconds, his face changed color, as if the blood had completely drained from him. Madison, bewildered, read the documents and looked up, searching for explanations her husband could no longer improvise. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Trevor tried to regain his composure, claiming it was all old accusations and unfortunate coincidences. But his voice trembled more than the teacup Carol had placed in front of him. Madison watched him with a mixture of disbelief and fear, as if she'd suddenly discovered she was living with a stranger. Carol, on the other hand, maintained the serenity of a nurse who'd seen the difference between a real crisis and a simulated one too many times. She didn't need to shout or accuse. She simply let the evidence speak for itself. That night, Madison returned alone. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she carried with her a silence filled with doubt. Sitting at the same table where they had shared endless breakfasts by the sea, she demanded an explanation from her mother, as if she suddenly wanted to regain all the years of lost trust. Carol didn't just repeat the obvious. She showed her in detail every document, every testimony, every number that fit into Trevor's plot. Madison listened silently, nodding her head, until she finally uttered the phrase Carol had waited so long for. "Mom, I think I need your help to get out of this." With that phrase, Carol felt something inside her shift, as if a broken bone had found its place again. It wasn't a victory. It was just the beginning of a different battle. Together, they contacted an old lawyer friend, someone who had worked on federal cases and knew the legal secrets where Trevor would try to hide. His first recommendation was clear. They couldn't confront him head-on again. They needed living proof, something that would unmask him beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's when the idea of using a hidden microphone arose, a strategy that, although it sounded like something out of a movie, fit perfectly with the real life they were facing. Madison accepted with a fear evident in every breath. Bravery wasn't about not trembling, but about trembling and still taking the step. Carol hugged her like she had when she was a child, reminding her that she had always been there to heal scraped knees and feverish nights. And that now would be no different. They worked out the plan in detail, a seemingly intimate conversation between Madison and Trevor, where she would coax him into discussing financial plans, hidden accounts, and the true reasons behind their marriage. The device was small, barely a jacket pin, but it carried the weight of an entire family history that was about to take a turn in another direction. The recording took place on a Friday night, when Trevor had drunk enough to become overconfident in his own cunning. Madison, her heart beating at a rate almost audible from outside, asked questions with the gentleness of someone caressing a wound. Trevor, believing himself invulnerable, began to speak. His words were laced with vanity. He boasted about having planned everything for years, about having studied the family's financial history, and about how Madison was the perfect match to close a circle his grandfather hadn't been able to complete. Each sentence fell like a hot iron on Carol's memory as she listened in real time from the car parked a few yards away, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. When Trevor finally mentioned the offshore accounts and his intention to access the beach house as collateral to move illicit money, the microphone clearly captured the confession that would condemn him. Madison maintained her composure, even though she wanted to scream inside and let him speak until he sank into his own trap. That same morning, the lawyer handed the recording to federal agents. For the first time in months, Carol, exhausted, felt she could breathe without the weight of a stone on her chest. They had crossed a threshold. They were no longer mother and daughter against an invisible wall, but two close allies in a case that would soon cease to be a family secret and become a major judicial matter. Trevor's arrest came at dawn, when there were still traces of fog covering the coast. The officers knocked firmly on the door, and Madison, her hands shaking, opened it without a word. Trevor barely had time to show his usual rehearsed smile before being read his rights. The scene was surreal. The man who had built an impeccable facade of control and charisma was being handcuffed in front of the very woman he had tried to erase from his own life. Carol watched from the stairwell with a mixture of relief and sadness, because no mother dreams of seeing her daughter go through such an experience, even if it was necessary to free herself. The following hours were a whirlwind of statements, signatures, and questions. The agents secured the evidence folder Carol had prepared, along with the recording of the confession. Madison had to repeat the details several times, each time growing firmer in her voice, as if recounting them convinced her she was finally awakening from a dangerous dream. Carol silently remained by her side, offering the same reassurance she had once provided with a simple caress on her forehead during childhood. Fevers. When they finally left the federal office, the cold air outside hit their faces like a slap, but also a welcome. They had endured their first great battle, and they were still together. The trial quickly became a media spectacle. Local newspapers ran eye-catching headlines, and newscasts opened with images of Trevor walking into the courtroom in handcuffs, trying to hold his chin high as if he still controlled the narrative. But what shocked Madison most was seeing Emma and Sarah appear, the women with whom he had repeated the same pattern in the past. Both agreed to testify, and their accounts coincided in chilling details. The isolation from their families, the promises of a bright future, and the sudden disappearance of financial resources. For Carol, hearing those voices confirmed that her intuition had been guided by something stronger than chance. She had seen the predator disguised as a prince from the first moment. Trevor's lawyers tried to dismiss the testimony as spite stories. But soon, a former associate, trapped by his own conscience or a court settlement, revealed the missing piece. Trevor had talked for years about a long-term plan to marry someone linked to the money that had disappeared decades earlier. Madison wasn't just a romantic target. She was the key piece in a chess game that stretched back to her grandfather's corruption. The silence in the courtroom after that statement was so heavy that even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. Carol, from the witness stand, clenched her hands in her lap and knew this was the moment when all the darkness was finally exposed to light. The sentence came after weeks of grueling hearings. Trevor was sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, in addition to millions in restitution to the victims his family had left in ruin. When the judge delivered the verdict, Madison collapsed on Carol's shoulder, as if the weight of everything she'd experienced had suddenly decided to crash down on her all at once. It wasn't a euphoric triumph, but a silent liberation, the kind that makes your body tremble without tears coming. Carol held her steady, reminding her without words that there was still a home waiting for her, not one made of walls and ceilings, but of the bond that no manipulation had managed to completely break. The following months were a slow process of reconstruction. Madison returned to the beach house with a small suitcase and eyes tired. From so much self-doubt, she found the same sand accumulated in the corners in the hallways, the same sun-faded chairs on the terrace, and in all of it, a reminder that there was a previous life, untouched, waiting for her. Carol didn't reproach her. Instead of speeches, she offered simple gestures: a hot cup of coffee, a folded blanket on the sofa, patient silence to listen to whatever her daughter wanted to share. That's how the wound began to heal. Not quickly or magically, but with the slow stitching of shared days. Madison began to apologize in halting phrases, as if the words weighed too much on their release. She said she had been blind, that she had confused control with love, and that, In her eagerness to build something of her own, she had ended up giving her entire life to an imposter. Carol listened without interrupting because she understood that guilt was a poison that drained little by little. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Madison would wake up startled, remembering some scene with Trevor, and Carol would find her in the kitchen, drinking water with trembling hands. Instead of speeches, she would sit by her side until the trembling subsided, as she had so often done on hospital calls with anxious patients. Little by little, life began to return to a lighter tone. Madison agreed to start therapy, and in the sessions, she discovered how much of herself she had lost during those years. Carol sometimes accompanied her, not to intervene, but to remind her that she was no longer alone on this journey. A forgotten complicity was reborn between them, cooking pancakes together in the vanilla-scented kitchen, strolling along the shore, collecting shells, laughing at old anecdotes that seemed dormant under layers of dust. Every moment was a building block in the rebuilding of a trust that had been on the verge of collapse, but now held firm with renewed strength. One summer day, when the sun fell slantingly on the terrace and the breeze carried the scent of seaweed, Madison confessed an unexpected desire. She wanted to get married again someday, but this time for real, with her mother by her side and in the same beach house Trevor had tried to turn into loot. Carol smiled with a tenderness that wrinkled her cheeks and replied that the place would always be open to celebrating whatever was born of love, not calculation. That conversation was like an invisible healing of wounds, confirmation that Madison no longer saw the house as a stage for manipulation, but as a rescued family sanctuary. News of the new beginning spread slowly among friends and neighbors, who welcomed Madison with heartfelt hugs and no trace of judgment. At gatherings on the pier, the talk was no longer of the court scandal, but of how mother and daughter had endured the unthinkable together. Carol noticed the difference in the way she was greeted, no longer as the widowed woman who had been cast aside, but as the centerpiece of an unexpected victory. Sometimes, walking back along the damp sand, she thought of her deceased husband and how, somehow, justice had also reached the past he carried with so much pain. Over time, Carol returned to enjoying the small rituals that once seemed empty. Lighting a candle at sunset, sweeping the terrace as the sea roared in the distance, preparing herbal tea with leaves she grew herself in rusty pots. But now every gesture was accompanied by Madison's laughter, which was slowly regaining its spontaneity. Trevor's shadows still appeared in the form of painful memories, but they no longer dominated conversations. They were mentioned as scars, not open wounds. Carol discovered that the true victory lay not in seeing Trevor condemned, but in seeing her daughter return to herself. A year later, mother and daughter held a small celebration at the beach house. It wasn't a wedding or a big event, just an intimate gathering with people who had supported them throughout the process. Instead of rehearsed music, there were improvised guitars. Instead of formal speeches, shared anecdotes that brought tears and laughter. When Madison raised a glass and publicly thanked her mother for not giving up, everyone applauded loudly. Carol, her eyes shining, understood that this was the true new beginning, not one imposed by a manipulator, but one woven with authentic bonds, rebuilt on the trust and love that had weathered the storm. That night, after the celebration, Carol went out onto the terrace alone and sat in the old rocking chair that had stood the test of time for 3 generations. The sea was dark and flecked with silvery moonlight, and she thought about everything that had changed since the morning she received that cold message asking for the keys to their honeymoon. It was as if the house itself had breathed with them, enduring the silence of the gray days and now accompanying them in the renewed calm. She closed her eyes and gave thanks, not with loud words, but with a long sigh that mingled with the salty breeze. Madison joined them soon after, carrying a blanket wrapped in her arms, and sat down beside her without needing to speak. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was a shared refuge. Carol ran her hand over her daughter's shoulder and understood that, despite everything, life had given them something more valuable than any financial restitution. The certainty that even after the deepest betrayal, love could be rebuilt. That night, they promised never to let anyone separate them again, and the constant sound of the ocean seemed to seal that invisible pact, like an eternal witness to their reconciliation. Over the months, Carol began to keep a journal where she recorded every step of her emotional recovery with Madison. She didn't do it with literary pretensions, but as a method to remember the nuances. The day they laughed until they cried while baking cookies that burned completely, the first time Madison walked alone along the pier, again without feeling afraid, or that afternoon when they both dared to look at old family photos without the pain stealing their breath. On each page, Carol understood that memory could also be a safe place, as long as it was accompanied by truth and not secrets. Madison, for her part, decided to resume her professional career, something she had put on hold while under Trevor's influence. With her mother's unconditional support, she landed a position at a small local firm where she could display her talents without feeling controlled. The sparkle returned to her eyes, not immediately, but with the perseverance of someone who waters a garden every day. Carol proudly observed each achievement, convinced that the best justice lay not only in seeing Trevor behind bars, but in seeing her daughter walk again with her own steps, free from invisible chains. The following summer, the beach house once again became the setting for new traditions. This time, there wasn't tension lurking in the corners, but laughter escaping through the open windows and the smell of freshly baked bread permeating the curtains. Carol invited some friends from the community over, and Madison prepared an impromptu toast in which she declared that the house would no longer be anyone's treasure, but the heart of her family. Those present applauded, and for the first time in a long time, Carol felt that every corner of her home was safe, not because of locks or keys, but because of the renewed strength of her relationship with her daughter. Amidst this renewed calm, Carol reflected on the long journey they had traveled. They had gone from isolation and manipulation to complicity and trust, from the threat of losing everything to the certainty that nothing could separate a true bond. Trevor was barely a distant echo in the newspapers and the courts, but he no longer dictated the course of their lives. The sea, which had witnessed tears and fear, was now an accomplice to hope. And in every wave that crashed against the shore, Carol found the same answer. They had survived, they had endured, and above all, they had triumphed together. As time passed, Carol understood that that battle hadn't been just against Trevor, but against the idea that she could be relegated, forgotten, or erased from her own daughter's life. The beach house still stood, just like her, as a symbol of resilience in the face of storms. Madison no longer saw her mother as an obstacle, but as the pillar that gave her freedom when she needed it most. Together, they learned that true love isn't always measured in words, but in the courage to face the truth even when it hurts. The last image that remained engraved in their memory was that of the two of them walking along the shore at sunset, the waves lapping at their feet and the wind tousling their hair. They didn't talk about lawsuits or fraud, but rather simple plans. Redecorate the terrace, plant new flowers, perhaps organize a future celebration in the same house where they had almost lost everything. In that shared horizon, they found peace. Carol, looking at her daughter, knew that the most valuable inheritance wasn't the house or the money, but the trust they had regained and the certainty that, despite everything, they had made it through together.